As I said in the opening PowerPoint, in this section, we'll identify types of disasters. Types are important because reactions may vary somewhat by type. Disasters have phases or stages that are fairly typical. Once you know this is true, you may not be so surprised by changes in an individual or community's attitudes over time. A person's life view, especially his or her culture, may strongly affect his or her reaction and beliefs about the place of this event in his or her life. Is it meant, or is it a response to some action? If you recall, after Katrina, we definitely heard different individuals' belief systems about what caused that disaster. As you know from the Rosenfeld text, for our purposes, a disaster involves the destruction of property, causes injury or loss of life, and affects a large group of people. An individual family may experience a sudden loss through violence or a loss of property, say if their home burns down. You would notice some of the same reactions if the disaster involves one or many people. However, for this course, we will most commonly be focusing on larger scale disasters. As you go along, you can make the connections to the individual ones. Just for the ease of discussion, I will be talking about disaster little d for individual reactions, or disaster big D for the larger, more complex kinds of disasters. All disasters are outside the realm of ordinary experience. Therefore, it is normal for people to have strong reactions. We'll talk much more about this as we go along. Not all disasters have a clear beginning and end, as we will discuss in just a few minutes. There can be some trouble categorizing these, as in natural disasters. Disasters are often not clean. Fires started by human error or human intention or lightning are all natural disasters. However, our response to them may be different. For instance, we may be very angry if there is a person who intentionally started a fire. And we have been aware of these in the western part of the country in the last few years. Natural disasters often come on suddenly or with moderate warning. Think about the earthquakes that we have seen in Haiti and in Chile in the last few weeks. Or they can come on very slowly, and we'll discuss those as well. Slow onset disasters are such things as droughts, most commonly, or they could be a series of snowfalls that cumulatively becomes a major disaster. We will be looking at this more when we consider community responses to disasters, because this type of disaster, as in the slow onset disaster, tends to affect whole areas and communities. Technological disasters are those disasters that occur because something man-made goes wrong or has a defect of some kind. You can see the picture on this slide of the bridge collapse that occurred a number of years ago. The most famous one in U.S. history would be the Challenger disaster. Think also of individual airplane crashes. Those are considered technological disasters. As it says on the slide, complex disasters are events of human intention. These are frequently more difficult for us to come to terms with. If you want to, after watching this slide, you could check out the clips from CNN that are also located on this site. This does not mean that people don't have very strong reactions to a disastrous event immediately after the event. Given the definition of disaster as an event threatening enough to cause disequilibrium to anyone, it is expected that people would respond in extraordinary ways. What is important for helpers is not to equate that immediate aftermath with some psychological syndrome or diagnosable emotional problem. In most cases, people with some support and some passage of time will right things. What we will be talking about in the next couple days is the response types that seem to assist most people back to their usual balance, or some semblance of normalcy, depending on how much damage and injury they have experienced from the disaster. As we see on this slide, disasters have phases or stages. When we think about the heroic phase, remember the story in the news about the married couple in China who were buried for 28+ hours holding each other, taking turns to breathe so they could stay alive. Imagine or remember stories that you have heard about people digging with their hands to help those who were trapped. People in the World Trade Center carried a colleague in a wheelchair down many flights of stairs so he could exit the building. These are all stories that go along with the heroic phase of disaster. In the honeymoon phase, there is the incredible relief that people are alive. The belief that we made it through, that others will help until life returns to normal. The next phase is disillusionment, which may last a few months or it could last several years. In this phase, the insurance company does not pay or does not pay very much. Volunteers go home. Money runs out. Programs do not do what one thought they would do. Family members have chronic effects from disaster and need constant care. We come to terms with life after a loved one dies. We may become bitter and angry. Reconstruction may last a very long time. On the Gulf Coast of the U.S., even many years later, now we're talking 5, people are still working on rebuilding their homes and opening schools. Many of them exhibit the anger and disillusionment of this phase. Listen to the news coming from Haiti and Chile, the locations of the most recent natural disasters in the news. Think about the difference in the two locations, especially after reading the section in the book questioning discrimination by natural disasters. Haiti has few resources to help itself, therefore needing significant help from outside. Its buildings were not earthquake resistant at all. The quake in Chile was much stronger than the one in Haiti, but human and property losses were significantly less. 200,000 deaths in Haiti, less than 1,000 in Chile, even though the earthquake in Chile was almost 100 times stronger than the earthquake in Haiti. When we think about reactions, they tend to change a little bit based on phases. For example, I spoke to a colleague in Baton Rouge in the days following Katrina. She told me she had terrible trouble sleeping, not because she wasn't tired, but because she felt guilty with all of the need in New Orleans, and she was safe. She could only go to sleep if she plugged in her cell phone and placed it on her pillow so that she could be called. You have read in your book the typical responses from children. The most important issue for children, in the early stages especially, is the availability of trusted adults and how those adults deal with the disaster event. Children's reaction change if the adults in their lives respond differently. In other words, if there is a tremendously variable reaction on the part of adults. Typically, parents often see their children's difficulties as being less severe than the children do. This has been found to be true in a number of research studies about children's response to disasters. When we think about factors that affect disaster response, it is important to remember that most people recover to pre-disaster levels within a few weeks or months, depending on some of these factors that are listed on this slide. More than 80% of people are in this group. Generally, boys and men have outward responses. They get angry, they become very physically active, they act out their responses, whereas girls and women tend to develop more anxiety or depression, sometimes called inward responses. When a disaster is man-made, reactions get more complicated. Someone did this to us. Why? The shock is very strong. A great deal of anger and blame is demonstrated. People, after the Oklahoma City bombing, were sure that the person who had organized this terrible calamity was from the Middle East, and were immediately looking for someone from the Middle East. The shock and outrage when they realized that the person who was the instigator of that event was homegrown was palpable. It was very strong. People didn't understand why. Sometimes it seems that natural disasters discriminate, as I mentioned earlier. It is interesting, if you look at some of the charts in the book, to compare loss of life in California versus Central America. The earthquake in California was even somewhat stronger, but the loss of life and property damage was less. People have to find a way in their own belief systems to understand how to proceed. Sometimes those belief systems can help their recovery. God will bring us through. Those are the things that you might hear. There were some public responses to 9/11 that said this was God's retribution for the sins of certain people. Age frequently affects our ability to recover from disasters. How much can a child understand versus a mature adult developmentally on target? It is different depending on a person's age, their prior experiences, their belief systems, and previous disaster events that they have lived through. This picture is of women in floods in Bangladesh. There are floods in Bangladesh on a regular basis. Culturally, young women in that area are not supposed to show their legs. When there is crowded living experience, for instance after a flood, some of these young women may then be considered unmarriageable because they have been, quote, seen, unquote. Tremendous infections resulted after women in the floods used menstrual cloths and could not wash them, or wash them in floodwaters that were filled with toxic and chemical substances. Culturally, women do not talk about these things with one another in the more traditional families in some parts of the world. Think about examples from your own life. What did your family or church say about 9/11 or about Katrina? In what specific ways could culture be supportive? For instance, banding together to pray or to support those who had experienced losses. I think about the Baptist men's group who have trucks ready to go because their faith believes that they are to immediately help, and they do. I think about the women who were raped in Darfur and the Sudan, who are expected to commit suicide because of the shame and the dishonor it brings to their families. I think about children born after Vietnam who were seen as outcasts and treated as such by the people in those areas. In the next few weeks, we will be discussing many types of disasters, and it is useful if you remember cultural events and cultural responses based on those. Prick up your ears and notice what it says in the news and realize that culture affects all of those responses.